It's the scorching summer of 1942, and the western desert stretches endlessly under the unforgiving sun. Rommel's aircraft cut across the sky, their cameras clicking relentlessly. From above, the desert seemed calm, almost empty, but the German intelligence officers were convinced they could read every inch of it. Every movement, every truck, every tank, they counted it all. They believed they knew exactly what the British had and where they were. On the ground, the British soldiers watched the skies, fully aware of their adversaries' relentless scrutiny. They knew Rommel's eyes were everywhere, that every photograph he took would be analyzed, catalogued, and scrutinized. But what the Germans did not understand was that the British had a secret of their own, a secret that would turn these routine reconnaissance missions into a trap for the mind. The British didn't rely on brute force or overwhelming firepower in this operation. Instead, they chose something subtler, something older than war itself: deception, making one thing look like another. They scaled this idea up, not just for a platoon or a single regiment, but for an entire armored division. Canvas, steel tubing, wooden frames, and ingenuity would become their weapons. Every day, the Germans flew over the desert, confident in their intelligence. They photographed convoys and positions, assuming they had a perfect picture of reality. They counted vehicles and men, tallying every tank and truck. They wrote detailed reports that would feed directly into Rommel's strategy. Every report reinforced their belief that they knew exactly where the British strength lay. But they didn't see the British Army at all, not the real one, and not the one the British had made appear before their eyes. From a distance, dummy tanks looked convincing, trucks seemed loaded with supplies, and artillery pieces pointed ominously toward the desert horizon. In the shadows of the late afternoon sun, the illusions stretched for miles. Each dummy was painstakingly built to trick the cameras and fool the observers in the sky. The British went further. Smoke pots, fake tracks, and carefully placed shadows added layers of realism. From the air, it was a flawless picture. From the ground, it looked empty, as if the real army had melted into the sands. And yet, to the Germans, the desert was alive with activity, a sprawling armored force moving and preparing to strike. Every photograph they collected confirmed the false reality. As Rommel's officers filed their reports, confidence grew. Every observation seemed to match their expectations. They never questioned the details, never considered that reality might be different. What they were seeing was exactly what the British wanted them to see. This was more than camouflage. It was a masterstroke of psychological warfare. The beauty of the plan lay in its simplicity. No complicated machinery, no elaborate explosions, just careful planning, attention to detail, and an intimate understanding of human perception. The desert itself became a canvas, and the British painted an army that was never truly there. Each dummy tank, each fake convoy was a brushstroke in a masterpiece of deception. By the time the Germans returned from their reconnaissance flights, they were convinced. Their reports filled the intelligence offices in Tripoli, Cairo, and Berlin, each word reinforcing the illusion. Yet every report was wrong, every photograph deceived, and every decision made based on that intelligence would be influenced by a phantom army that existed only in the minds of the enemy. The desert stretched on, endless and unyielding, but the real story was unfolding in shadows and in silence. Rommel's eyes saw everything except what truly mattered. And in that gap between perception and reality, the British had found their advantage, quietly, brilliantly, and with a confidence that would soon alter the course of the Western Desert Campaign.
The British Army had long understood that in war, what the enemy believes can be just as important as what is real. In the deserts of North Africa, where heat shimmered off the sand and mirages played tricks on the eyes, this lesson became a weapon. The Germans relied heavily on reconnaissance, trusting what their cameras captured and what their officers reported. But the British knew that perception could be manipulated and that even the most careful observer could be fooled. Deception is an ancient art, older than gunpowder. Armies have always used tricks to mislead, to distract, to confuse. Sometimes it was as simple as raising banners where no troops existed, or lighting fires to suggest movement at night. But the British were taking this old strategy and scaling it up to an unprecedented level. They weren't just trying to hide a few soldiers, they wanted to create an entire phantom army that could occupy the imagination of the enemy. The planners in Cairo and London understood that the desert offered the perfect stage. Flat terrain, endless horizons, and the relentless sun made everything more visible from the air. Every shadow, every glint of metal could be read by a trained eye, or misread. British engineers, artists, and soldiers collaborated to turn this vulnerability into an advantage. They would use steel, wood, canvas, and paint to construct vehicles, artillery, and supply convoys that looked convincing from miles above. Attention to detail was crucial. A dummy tank had to cast the right shadow, appear the correct size from the air, and be positioned with realistic spacing. Convoys were arranged to mimic typical British formations, with trucks carrying fake supplies and carefully raked tracks suggesting movement and weight. Engineers studied photographs of real units, copying every detail they could replicate, ensuring that nothing betrayed the illusion. But it wasn't just about objects. Movement and routine mattered too. Soldiers created fake activity, small gatherings at strategic points, the occasional dust trail, and the faint shimmer of tents in the heat. Smoke pots simulated engine heat or campfires, while shadows shifted subtly as the sun moved, adding depth to the deception. Every visual cue was meticulously planned, designed to convince even the most experienced German observer. The genius of the plan was that it didn't require constant maintenance. The desert environment, harsh as it was, could work with the deception. Sandstorms, heat haze, and the sun's glare naturally distorted shapes, making dummy tanks and trucks appear more realistic. Even Rommel's reconnaissance pilots, skilled and experienced, would struggle to separate the real from the artificial, especially when their expectations matched the illusion being presented. At the heart of this operation was psychology. The British understood that humans are pattern-seeking creatures. We trust what we expect to see. The Germans expected an armored division, and the British gave them exactly that, on paper and in the air, even if it did not exist on the ground. The planners relied on this cognitive bias, turning it into a weapon more powerful than any gun or tank. By the time the Germans had seen and documented these positions, the illusion had already done its work. Their reports reinforced the deception, spreading false confidence throughout the command structure. Every observation that matched their expectations made them even less likely to question what they were seeing. In this way, the British had created a reality that existed only in the minds of the enemy, a reality that would shape strategy, movement, and even morale without a single shot being fired. This was more than camouflage. It was storytelling on a grand scale, a narrative of strength and preparedness crafted from fabric and imagination. The British didn't just hide, they performed. The desert became a theater, the dummy tanks were actors, and every photograph was a carefully framed scene. And while Rommel's forces believed they were gathering intelligence, they, in fact, were being deceived at every turn. By the time night fell over the desert, the Germans had recorded their observations, sent their reports, and believed they understood the British positions perfectly. Yet in reality, the ground beneath them was silent. The tanks were hollow shells, and the army they feared existed only as an illusion. This operation demonstrated that sometimes the most formidable weapon in war is not firepower, but the ability to shape the mind of your enemy, to make them see what you want them to see, and to make them act based on a lie that feels entirely real.
The British plan had moved from theory into action. On the scorching sands of the Western Desert, teams of engineers, artists, and soldiers worked tirelessly to build an army that existed only in appearance. From a distance, it would be indistinguishable from a real armored division. Up close, it was nothing more than steel tubing, canvas, and carefully painted wood. But the illusion had to be flawless. Every dummy tank was a miniature engineering marvel. Engineers studied photographs and blueprints of British armored vehicles, copying proportions and features to ensure that when seen from the air, the shapes were convincing. Canvas covers were stretched over light frames to mimic turrets and barrels. Painted details suggested hatches, rivets, and tracks. Even the angles of the shadows were considered, because pilots in reconnaissance aircraft would judge size and distance based on sunlight and shadow patterns. Trucks were next. Wooden frames, carefully arranged wheels, and canvas tarps created the impression of supplies ready to move. Soldiers raked the sand around the vehicles to make the tracks appear as though they had been driven by real engines. Convoys were laid out in precise formations, mimicking the spacing and patterns of actual British movements. From above, it looked like a well-organized column of tanks and supply trucks crawling across the desert. But it wasn't just static displays. The British added subtle touches to simulate activity. Smoke pots were placed near dummy vehicles to suggest running engines. Small groups of soldiers moved between the real and fake units, creating dust clouds that reinforced the illusion of motion. Even the placement of tents, fuel barrels, and makeshift camps followed patterns observed in real operations, ensuring that aerial reconnaissance photographs would tell a convincing story. Engineers had to be clever because some features couldn't be easily replicated. Machine guns, antennas, and artillery barrels were suggested with simple sticks and pieces of metal, positioned to create the right shapes in shadows. From the air, detail mattered more than material. A wooden stick painted black could look like a cannon barrel from 1,000 feet above. The British understood that the enemy would never get close enough to inspect, and that their work needed only to satisfy the cameras in the sky. Logistics were also part of the deception. Dummy vehicles had to be moved occasionally to simulate the movements of a real army. Dust trails were created with sweeping brushes, and tracks were laid in patterns consistent with a division on the march. Engineers even accounted for the sun's angle, ensuring that shadows fell naturally across the fake tanks and trucks. Every detail was a test of patience, precision, and imagination. Coordination between units was critical. Engineers, artists, and soldiers worked in shifts, often under the blazing sun, to complete large areas of dummy formations. Convoys of fake trucks stretched for miles across the desert. Artillery emplantments dotted strategic positions, and tank divisions seemed to assemble with the efficiency of real formations. It was a massive, labor-intensive performance that demanded both creativity and discipline. The psychological impact of these constructions cannot be overstated. From above, the Germans saw an army that seemed ready to strike, an armored force perfectly positioned and resupplied. They counted vehicles, identified formations, and assumed that every photo confirmed British strength. In reality, there were no tanks rolling across the desert, no artillery ready to fire. Every report they sent back reinforced a lie crafted with meticulous care. The British even adapted to mistakes. When reconnaissance aircraft approached too closely or shadows revealed inconsistencies, engineers adjusted positions, repaired frames, and repainted surfaces to maintain the illusion. The desert itself, with its heat haze and shifting sands, helped disguise imperfections, but constant vigilance ensured that the ruse remained convincing. By the end of the day, a vast network of dummy tanks, trucks, and artillery sprawled across the desert, stretching for miles, shimmering under the sun. To the German pilots flying overhead, it was a formidable, well-prepared force. Every camera shutter clicked, capturing evidence that would feed into Rommel's decision-making. Every photograph reinforced the story the British wanted to tell. In the harsh, silent desert, the real army remained hidden, conserving strength, while a phantom force occupied the minds of the enemy. The success of the deception depended not just on construction, but on imagination, precision, and an understanding of how humans perceive reality. The British had not just built dummies, they had built an army of illusions, a performance so convincing that it could shape the course of battles without a single shot being fired.
From the sky, the western desert looked alive with movement. German reconnaissance pilots flew their daily missions, cameras clicking as they recorded what they believed was the full extent of the British Army. They saw tanks in formation, convoys of trucks, artillery ready to fire. Every detail reinforced the assumption that the British were fully prepared, well supplied, and poised for battle. But what they didn't see was reality. The tanks were empty shells, the trucks hollow, the artillery nothing more than painted wood and steel tubing. Back at headquarters, Rommel's intelligence officers studied the photographs with confidence. They counted vehicles, marked positions, and plotted what they assumed were the British defenses. Every report confirmed their expectations. The desert seemed full of threats, every inch mapped, every force accounted for. Yet the army they feared existed only in illusion. Not a single German officer suspected that they were looking at deception on a massive scale. The brilliance of the British plan lay in its subtlety. There was no need for explosions, no sudden maneuvers, no smokescreens in battle. The deception worked simply because it matched what the Germans expected to see. Pattern recognition, assumption, and overconfidence became weapons in themselves. Each photograph taken from above appeared flawless. Each report filed reinforced a lie that was carefully constructed to appear real. Occasionally, a German pilot would spot something that seemed unusual, a shadow that didn't quite match a tank, or a dust trail that appeared too perfect. But the reports consistently minimized these details. Human perception is selective, and when every other observation confirms your expectations, anomalies are often ignored. The British understood this principle well, exploiting it fully. The Germans began to make strategic decisions based on the phantom army. They concentrated forces in areas where nothing existed, shifted supplies to meet threats that were only visual illusions, and postponed attacks thinking the British were stronger than they truly were. Every false position occupied valuable German attention, slowing decision-making and creating confusion. Even Rommel himself was taken in. The reports painted a picture of an army poised, organized, and ready to strike. He directed operations based on this intelligence, unaware that he was maneuvering against shadows. The British had turned observation into misdirection, turning the enemy's strength, information gathering, into a vulnerability. Meanwhile, the real British units remained concealed, moving quietly and efficiently across the desert. Supplies were transported under cover, positions reinforced, and true strength preserved. While the Germans focused on the illusions, the British controlled the real battlefield without interference.
The Phantom Army had succeeded in buying time, misdirecting attention, and creating a psychological advantage. The impact was not just tactical, but psychological. German confidence in their intelligence grew, but it was misplaced. Every photograph confirmed the Phantom Army. Every report strengthened the illusion. The enemy believed they understood reality, when in fact their entire perception had been shaped by deliberate deception. This was psychological warfare at its most effective, influencing not through force but by shaping belief. The British continued to refine the deception. Movements of dummy convoys were adjusted, dust trails swept to simulate activity, and new dummy units were added to fill perceived gaps. Engineers monitored the shadows, checked angles, and ensured that the illusion remained seamless. The Germans were unaware that every decision they made was being guided by a mirage, a carefully orchestrated performance on the sands of the desert. By the end of the operation, the Germans had become prisoners of their own observations. They moved as if confronted by a vast force, diverted resources to counter non-existent threats, and underestimated the real British positions hidden nearby. The desert, silent and vast, had become a stage for deception, and the enemy's eyes, though keen, had been thoroughly misled. In the end, it was a testament to British ingenuity and discipline. Without firing a single shot, they had manipulated the perceptions of a formidable adversary, turning intelligence gathering into an instrument of illusion. And as Rommel's forces adjusted to the Phantom Army, the British could operate freely, knowing that the desert itself had been transformed into a weapon of war.
When the dust settled over the western desert, the British deception operation had accomplished something extraordinary. It wasn't measured in enemy tanks destroyed or territory gained. Its success was in something far subtler: the minds of the enemy. Rommel and his intelligence officers believed they had a complete picture of the British forces, yet every photograph, every report had been carefully orchestrated to tell a lie. The Germans had fought not just against an army, but against imagination itself. The operation became a model for psychological warfare, demonstrating that perception could be as powerful a weapon as firepower. By manipulating what the enemy thought they saw, the British had shaped decisions, movements, and strategies across the battlefield. Every diversion, every phantom convoy, every dummy tank was a victory without a single shot fired. It proved that in war, intelligence could be deceived, and the mind of the adversary could be the most critical battlefield of all. This audacious ruse did more than protect British forces. It bought them time. While Rommel focused on shadows and illusions, real units could maneuver, supply lines remained safe, and strategic positions were reinforced. Commanders on the ground had the freedom to operate without interference from German forces misled by the deception. It was an elegant balance of cunning, patience, and meticulous planning, a chess game played across the sands with invisible pieces. The legacy of this operation extended far beyond the Western Desert. Lessons learned from creating phantom armies would inform later operations in the war, most famously the elaborate deceptions before D-Day. Operation Fortitude, the Allied plan to convince the Germans that the invasion of Europe would occur at Pas-de-Calais instead of Normandy, relied on the same principles: dummy vehicles, fake radio traffic, and carefully crafted misinformation. The seeds planted in North Africa grew into strategies that shaped the course of the war in Europe. Historians have since marveled at the scale and audacity of the British plan. It required not just ingenuity, but discipline, coordination, and an understanding of psychology that few armies possessed at the time. Engineers, soldiers, and planners worked in harmony, blending technical skill with creative vision.
The desert, a harsh and unforgiving environment, became a canvas for artful deception. Every line of a shadow, every glint of painted steel was a stroke in a masterpiece of illusion. Beyond the tactical and strategic gains, the operation also reshaped how military intelligence was perceived. Commanders realized that intelligence is only as reliable as the context in which it is interpreted, and that the enemy's assumptions can be exploited. Deception became an essential tool in modern warfare, a reminder that not everything seen is real, and not every threat is what it seems. The ability to control perception became a force multiplier, often achieving results that brute force alone could not. For the soldiers who executed the operation, there was a quiet satisfaction in knowing they had outsmarted a formidable opponent. They labored under the desert sun, assembling dummy tanks and convoys, understanding that their work was invisible in one sense, yet monumental in its effect. Their success was a testament to the power of ingenuity, imagination, and meticulous planning. They had turned the art of deception into a weapon capable of altering the course of campaigns. In retrospect, the Phantom Army of the Western Desert is remembered not just for the cleverness of its construction, but for the way it demonstrated a fundamental truth of warfare. Reality can be manipulated. The enemy sees what you allow them to see, and every perception can be guided, shaped, or misdirected. The British had mastered this art, leaving a mark in military history that continues to inspire strategists and historians alike. By the time the war moved on to Europe, the lessons of North Africa had been internalized. Commanders understood that deception could achieve results impossible through conventional means. Every fake tank, every simulated convoy, every shadow in the desert had contributed to a larger victory, one won in the minds of the enemy before a single battle was fought. The legacy was clear. In war, the most formidable force may be not what you wield, but what your enemy believes exists. And so the sands of the Western Desert remain a silent witness to one of the most audacious ruses in modern warfare. A phantom army had marched, not across the ground, but across the perceptions of a vigilant enemy. The Germans never realized the truth until it was too late, and the British had proven that sometimes the greatest weapon is imagination itself, executed with precision, patience, and daring that would echo through history.